It's hard not to feel a little bit shaken when you hear about something like that Delta plane crash in Toronto. Thankfully, everyone survived, but it's still kind of stark reminder of just how quickly things can go wrong up in the air.
We're going to do a deep dive into what happened with Delta Flight 4819, look at the timeline, the conditions, and compare it to a couple of other recent aviation incidents that you flagged, just to see if there are any bigger lessons we can learn.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a situation that grabs your attention, especially with all the real-time updates that we get these days.
Mhm.
Um, what struck me was how, even though there were injuries, the fact that there were no fatalities in a crash like that, that's pretty remarkable.
Right. It makes you think about how chaotic it must have been for those on board. So, based on the sources that you shared, the flight left Minneapolis around 10:30 a.m. Central Time and ended up flipping upon landing in Toronto around 2:45 p.m. Eastern. Or our flight, which seems pretty standard for that route. But what's not standard is trying to land a plane in what sounds like a full-blown blizzard. The sources mention blowing snow, strong winds, even frigid temperatures, all things that make a pilot's job infinitely harder.
Yeah, and that's what I find fascinating. We often hear about pilot error, but how much of that is actually due to incredible challenging conditions that they're dealing with? I mean, these guys are trained for tough situations,
Uh,
but there's got to be a limit.
Absolutely. Think about it. Even driving in those conditions can be nerve-wracking. Now imagine doing it at hundreds of miles per hour with 80 lives in your hands. There are so many factors at play that it's rarely a simple error. Investigators will be looking closely at the weather data, the pilot's actions, and the plane's systems to try and piece together exactly what happened.
You mentioned investigators, and it seems like a lot of agencies are involved, the FAA,
Yeah.
NTSB, and even the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. What's the process like when you have so many groups working in an investigation like this?
Think of it like a team of specialized detectives, each bringing their expertise to the table. The FAA focuses on overall aviation regulations here in the U.S. The NTSB is our go-to for accident investigations. And the TSB of Canada will be providing their perspective and data since the crash happened on their soil.
So, a multi-pronged approach to really get to the bottom of things. And thankfully, it seems like they're taking it seriously. One of the sources mentioned Delta canceled all their remaining flights in and out of Toronto Pearson that day.
Yeah, that's not a decision they make lightly. It shows a commitment to safety, not just for the passengers on that specific flight, but for everyone traveling through that airport. It also allows them to really focus resources on the investigation and make sure everything is thoroughly checked before things go back to normal.
Okay, let's unpack the human side of this for a moment.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned 19 people were treated for injuries, and 3 were hospitalized, including a child. That's got to be a terrifying experience for everyone involved, even those who weren't physically hurt.
Absolutely. It's not just the physical injuries, but the emotional and psychological impact as well. You're talking about a traumatic event. That could have easily been much worse. There's the shock of the crash, the chaos of the evacuation, and then the lingering anxiety that can come with surviving something like this. It's important to remember that even though everyone made it out alive, there's still a long road to recovery for many of them.
It really makes you appreciate the work of the first responders and medical teams who are on the scene. They're the ones who have to deal with the immediate aftermath. And their training and quick thinking can make a huge difference in those critical moments.
Right. And their work doesn't stop at the scene. They also play a vital role in supporting the passengers and crew in the hours and days that follow, making sure they have access to the medical and psychological care they need.
So we've got this Delta crash in Toronto, and you also flagged a couple of other recent incidents for us to consider. A mid-air collision in Washington, D.C., and a medical jet crash in Philadelphia. Is there a reason you think these are worth looking at together?
Well, on the surface, they seem like isolated events, right? Different locations, different types of aircraft. But when you start to dig deeper, you might find some unsettling similarities, especially when it comes to the potential for human error in highly complex systems.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of similarities are we talking about?
For example, that mid-air collision in D.C., a tragedy where everyone on both the American Airlines plane and the Army Black Hawk helicopter lost their lives. It really highlights the critical role of communication and air traffic control. Even the smallest miscommunication or oversight can have devastating consequences in the air.
So in that case, are we talking about potential errors on the part of the pilots or the air traffic controllers?
It's rarely that simple. Investigations into these kinds of accidents are incredibly thorough. They look at everything: pilot training records, air traffic control logs, weather conditions, mechanical issues, you name it. And what they often find is not one single point of failure, but a chain of events, a series of small things that add up to a catastrophe.
That makes sense. It's like the saying, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. One small thing can have a ripple effect.
Exactly. And in aviation, those ripples can be felt for miles. Now, the medical jet crash in Philadelphia, where everyone on board and one person on the ground died, that brings up another critical factor: maintenance. We often focus on pilot error. But what about the planes themselves? Are they being maintained properly? Are there any underlying mechanical issues that might contribute to an accident?
That's a good point. It's easy to assume that planes are always in tip-top shape, but I imagine the reality is much more complicated.
Definitely. These are incredibly complex machines, with thousands of parts that need to work perfectly in sync. Regular maintenance and inspections are crucial. But even then, things can slip through the cracks. Investigators will be looking closely at the maintenance records of all three planes involved in these accidents, searching for any red flags that might have been missed.
So we've got potential communication issues in D.C., maintenance concerns in Philadelphia, and then that Delta crash in Toronto, where weather seems to have played a major role. Do you see any common threads emerging here?
What I find most compelling is the human element in all of this. We have systems and procedures in place, and for the most part, they work. But we also have human beings operating within those systems. And human beings make mistakes.
We talked earlier about how challenging it must be to land a plane in those kinds of weather conditions, but what about things like pilot fatigue? Could that have contributed to any of these incidents?
That's a crucial question, and one that investigators will definitely be exploring. Pilots are under immense pressure to maintain schedules, even in less than ideal conditions. Long hours, irregular sleep patterns, and jet lag can all take a toll on their performance, leading to slower reaction times and impaired decision-making.
That makes sense. It's like when you've been driving for hours and you start to get drowsy. Your focus slips. You might miss a sign. You're just not as sharp.
Exactly, and in aviation, those lapses in focus can have devastating consequences. There are regulations in place to limit pilot flight time and ensure they get adequate rest, but there's always a push and pull between safety concerns and the demands of the industry.
So it's a balancing act. And it sounds like there's no easy answer. But I'm curious, beyond pilot fatigue and the things we've already discussed, what are some of the less obvious factors that investigators might be looking at when trying to figure out what caused these crashes?
Well, think about the complexity of these systems. You have the pilots, the air traffic controllers, the ground crew, the mechanics, and then all the technology and equipment involved. There's so many potential points of failure that it can be overwhelming to even consider them all.
So where do they even begin?
They start by gathering as much data as possible: the black boxes, cockpit voice recordings, air traffic control logs, weather reports, maintenance records. It's like piecing together a giant puzzle. And every piece matters. They'll be looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might shed light on what went wrong.
It sounds incredibly meticulous, and it makes you realize just how much work goes into ensuring air travel safety.
Absolutely. And it's a continuous process. As technology evolves and air traffic increases, we need to constantly adapt and improve our systems to stay ahead of the curve. These accidents, as tragic as they are, serve as valuable learning opportunities. By studying them carefully, we can identify areas for improvement and make air travel even safer in the future.
Okay, so we've talked about the Delta crash,
Yeah.
the mid-air collision in D.C., and the medical jet crash in Philadelphia. What does all of this tell us about the state of aviation safety today? Are we getting better, or are we seeing a worrying trend?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The truth is, it's a bit of both. Aviation safety has come a long way, planes are more reliable, training is more rigorous, and we have sophisticated systems in place to prevent accidents. But as we've been discussing, there's always room for improvement. And these recent incidents highlight the areas where we need to focus our attention.
So it's not necessarily that things are getting worse, but that we're becoming more aware of the complexities and the potential for things to go wrong, even with all the safeguards we have in place.
Exactly. And that awareness is crucial. It drives innovation, it leads to better training protocols, and it pushes us to constantly reevaluate our systems and procedures. Think about it this way. Every time there's an accident, we learn something new. We learn about the limits of our technology, the vulnerabilities in our systems, and the ways in which human error can factor into even the most carefully planned operations.
It's like you said earlier, it's rarely one single thing that causes a major accident. It's usually a chain of events,
Yeah.
a series of seemingly small things that add up to something catastrophic.
Right, and sometimes those small things are outside of our control, like a sudden shift in weather conditions. But often they're things we can address through better training, clear communication, and a relentless focus on safety at every level.
You keep mentioning the human element,
Yeah.
and I think that's what's really sticking with me. We can design the most advanced planes, implement the most sophisticated systems, but at the end of the day, it's people who are making the decisions, operating the equipment,
Yeah.
and responding to unexpected situations.
And people get tired. They make mistakes. They sometimes misinterpret information, or they get complacent. That's why it's so important to have systems in place that account for human fallibility, redundancy, clear communication protocols, checklists. These aren't just bureaucratic hurdles, they're lifesavers.
It's interesting because when you hear about these incidents in the news, it's easy to focus on the drama, the who's to blame aspect of it all. But what you're highlighting is that it's often much more nuanced than that. It's about understanding the complexities, the interconnectedness of all these factors, and working to strengthen the system as a whole.
I couldn't have said it better myself. We need to move away from a culture of blame and towards a culture of learning. That means being open to new information, challenging our assumptions, and constantly seeking ways to improve. And it's not just the responsibility of pilots and air traffic controllers. It's everyone involved in the industry, from the mechanics who maintain the planes to the regulators who set the standards.
And even the passengers to some extent. We all have a role to play in speaking up if we see something that seems unsafe, following safety instructions. Yeah, and just being generally aware of our surroundings.
Absolutely. Safety is a shared responsibility. And the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to contribute to a safer travel experience for everyone.
This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've gained a much deeper understanding of not just the events themselves, but the entire system that surrounds aviation safety. It's both reassuring and a bit daunting to realize just how much goes into keeping us safe in the air.
It's a complex and constantly evolving field, but one that's filled with dedicated professionals who are passionate about what they do. And while accidents like these are tragic reminders of the risks involved, they also serve as catalysts for improvement. By learning from these mistakes and working together to strengthen our systems, we can continue to make air travel one of the safest modes of transportation in the world.
Well said. And for you listening, remember that knowledge is power. The more you understand about how things work, the better equipped you are to make informed decisions and to contribute to a safer world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration into a fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and safe travels.